Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
I am your host, Keith, and welcome back to the podcast. Really glad that you have joined us this week. I'm really excited about this particular podcast episode, as it's going to be our first episode where we're kind of breaking down a book. That book is Phillip K. Dick's novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? It is the book that the Bladerunner films are based off of. I promise this is probably the last time I'm going to focus on the Bladerunner stuff. There's just a lot of really meaningful content between the two movies and this book that I think really deserves a lot of analysis and visitation. So I just wanted to kind of compare the two films to the book and then have a discussion of the themes of the book as well. There's a lot of different themes that happen in the books that also happen in the movies that I think really helps to contribute to making them worth a lot of discussion. Hence why we're having, what is this, I think the second or third episode at least, on Blade Runner specifically. So, I do apologize, but also I'm not sorry. So, the book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, focuses primarily on Rick Deckard and his journey to retire several Nexus 6 androids. I don't know if they're referred to as replicants in the book. I've been listening to the audiobook, so I could possibly have missed a couple of references to them as being replicants. But in the movies, they're called replicants. In the books, they're called androids. And they are portrayed in the books as being both organic and inorganic in their composition, which I think is interesting because in the movies they're portrayed, or we're told that they're made of completely organic material, so they're completely cellular based. But in the books, apparently they have some robotic components to them, ? In order to identify a replicant, they still have to do a bone marrow analysis. So I'm not totally sure exactly as to what electric components they would have, but the book seems to play pretty loose, or pretty fast and loose, with the differences between like an electric creature or electric organism and a completely biological organism, but we'll get into that pretty soon. As far as a review of the book is concerned, overall, I've been pretty impressed with Dick's approach to the content. It is definitely philosophically dense. I can see why he is considered to be one of the better science fiction writers of the last century. I can also see why he might not make it on like certain people's best science fiction authors lists. His writing is very good, but I find that he often relies too much on the idea of telling, not showing. So he'll have an interaction between two characters that occurs, and he'll describe it in too much detail. But I think that it is intentional on his part because his approach generally feels very clinical. And what I mean by that is because he's writing science fiction from a specific viewpoint, he is very much trying to get us in the head of the character, and I think that sometimes his descriptions and things like that ultimately match what the character would think. So and his characters seem to be pretty concrete in their characteristics. They don't seem to have a lot of ambiguity to them. So if he were to describe things ambiguously, it would kind of take away from our presence with the character rather than adding to it, because the viewpoint is generally like third person mixed with first person, and a lot of the third person matches the mentality of the first person. I think most of this book is in first person, but there's occasional times where he'll describe a scene or something that's like a little bit outside of the immediate viewpoint of the character who's experiencing it. But generally he sticks to first person, so a lot of the descriptions are going to match the interpretation of that person's view of the world. And in this book especially, because Rick Deckard is portrayed as very much like a straight shooter, kind of like doesn't really think about his job too much until he absolutely has to type of thing, then we're going to get descriptions that are the same. And I found that he uses a lot of adverbs, which just generally as a rule when you're writing, you want to avoid adverbs because they take away from the reader's ability to interpret how a character might be interacting with the world, and they are kind of abrasive. So as far as like very successful writers are concerned, they don't use a ton of adverbs, and they leave a lot of things up to ambiguity so that readers can impart themselves into a character. But I don't think that that was ultimately Dick's goal in this particular novel. I think that his goal was to put us inside the headspace of Deckard in a very specific way. So I think he has accomplished that. I think the book is definitely good. I don't mean to sound like a negative Nancy when it comes to talking about it. I just think that, it's not as poetic or as strong in its prose as something by Ray Bradbury, for instance. It is much more, I wouldn't say scientifically based, but it just feels very much like a straightforward interpretation of the world, which has its pros because it does match how the main character, Rick Deckard, interprets the world, but it also has its cons because it can be abrasive at times. So that being said, the basic summary of the book is very similar to the films, and there is a lot of really great exposition. There are some additional storylines or plot points that I've found to be that add a lot to the story that they omitted from the films. One of those is the story of John Isidore, who is, I think, partially represented in the films by the gentleman who helps design the biological components of replicants. In the original Blade Runner film, there is essentially a guy who kind of serves like a toy maker type role who befriends the androids, and he seems to be a little bit different. And I don't remember his name. It may have been Isidore. I wouldn't be surprised, but I think it's a pretty clear parallel between that character and Isidore in the novels, because he's the only human being who really befriends the replicants / androids. And John Isidore does the same thing in the novel. Something that isn't mentioned in the movies, in either one, but is a pretty prevalent theme in the novel, is how the world came to be the way that it is. And I think that it's really interesting, and it adds a lot to the story. They're basically, in the book, the world has become like a desolate wasteland that is constantly ravaged by radiation storms because of a nuclear war and nuclear fallout. And the way in which most of that radiation is transferred into individuals is through, they call it dust. And it's basically just radioactive fallout in the form of small dust particulates that will swirl around and go to certain areas, and so people will get infected with the fallout. And eventually, if you are infected enough by this radioactive fallout, or affected enough by it, then you can become what's called a special. And specials are individuals who essentially either their IQ has been depleted because of the radiation poisoning, or they're disfigured, or a big one is that they're impotent. There's specific mention of the fact that they sell girdles for men to help you avoid becoming impotent and therefore becoming a special, which I thought was a really interesting element to include in the book. There is a lot of like subversive or like subconscious kind of like sexual language and things that Phillip K. Dick uses. At one point, he basically says that relationships between men and women, as far as love are concerned, are equivalent to the idea of reproduction rather than like a valuing of the individual. It's a valuing of the act between two individuals, which I think is part of Phillip K. Dick's overall view on the world, which I think is very interesting because it is a very clinical approach to the idea of human relations, a very transactional approach. And we'll see a lot of that type of interaction between individuals as the novel goes on. So we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to get into more of the main themes in the novel and comparing those to the main themes in the movies. So we'll be right back.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Specifically in regards to relationships between individuals. This particular worldview, where there's a belief that love is equivalent to the act of reproduction, aka sex, I think is a very interesting belief to take, or at least a very interesting statement to make. I think that one of the main themes of this novel is the idea of questioning the sincerity of emotions or questioning the sincerity of empathy. I've mentioned on this podcast before the idea of like evolutionary drives that we as individuals believe to be a sincere form of expression because they have an emotional component to them. But I think what Phillip K. Dick is trying to say in this particular statement is that there are things in the world that we interact with in a way that our thinking mind tricks us into thinking that those things are emotionally based and therefore sincere. So I'm not necessarily saying that I agree with this viewpoint, but just to kind of explore it so that we can gain a little bit of understanding critically for both the films and the book. The idea is essentially that we have an emotional attachment to this idea of love between two individuals in a heterosexual relationship, specifically for Dick. There's no real mention of anything aside from that, so that's what we're going to stick to just for the sake of this discussion, not for the sake of any particular belief structure or anything like that. So the reproductive process is something that we are evolutionarily inclined to complete. At least most individuals are. Obviously, there are exceptions, of course. But because we are evolutionarily inclined to complete this process, there is coding placed into our DNA that causes our brain to react to things in very specific ways. You know, if a heterosexual person sees someone of the opposite gender, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of tiny little subconscious thoughts as well as conscious ones that will dictate our desire to interact with that person in a way that would solicit a evolutionarily successful interaction, if you're understanding what I'm saying. The podcast is generally supposed to be PG, so I'm trying to avoid saying anything too explicit. So our brain, in a way, inclines us to think a specific way about somebody of the opposite gender. Because of society, we believe that those feelings come from a place of perhaps emotion as well as objectification, especially for people of the male persuasion. It seems have a higher proclivity for this particular thought process. And I'm only saying that, again, because of the way in which I've experienced culture. I am not familiar with the way in which a woman has experienced that particular aspect of culture, so I'm just speaking from a very limited point of view. So I want to emphasize that this is just my very small, limited point of view. So as someone of the male persuasion, there are a number of different factors that contribute to the desire to interact with someone of the opposite gender, specifically in a way that would solicit, again, an evolutionarily successful interaction. And part of that is socially, that there is an emotional bond that is desired, or that we have a desire to form. But ultimately, if you look at just scientifically what the purpose of most biological entities is, that purpose is to perpetuate their own existence, be that perpetuating it in the form of art or in the form of creation, which I think art is representative of creation in a certain way, in a very abstract way that subconsciously plays on the same ideas of the desire to reproduce. But that's a subject for maybe another podcast, or maybe if we're lucky, we'll get to visit that later. But ultimately, it is the social obligation that we are brought up to believe that those feelings or those desires have deeper meaning than just the simple act in itself. And so when Phillip K. Dick portrays that act as being the basis of love, one, I think it kind of says that he's experienced something in his life that caused him to think in that particular way. That's most likely some sort of rough breakup, if I'm being honest. So, I've been there with you, Philip. I totally understand. I don't think ultimately that people's interactions with each other are based solely on the evolutionary prerogatives that are coded into our DNA. But I will say that in a way, I do think that he is making a profound statement about human interaction when he describes interactions between the opposite genders as being ultimately only about reproduction. And the reason this comes up is because one of the major themes in this novel, which you don't really get to until you're at least about halfway through, is this idea that Rick Deckard has started to develop some sort of empathy for the androids that he is retiring. So if you remember from the previous podcasts, the basic premise of Bladerunner is that Blade Runners are individuals who hunt down escaped androids who have come to Earth to live illegally here. In the movie, they originally only have a 4-year lifespan, which they kind of retcon in the 2049 movie, but in the original, the replicants only have a 4-year lifespan and then they expire, but they could do a lot of damage in the time that they're on Earth in 4 years. So Harrison Ford's character, also named Rick Deckard, goes to retire them. And he has a similar experience to the Rick Deckard of the book, where he finds himself empathizing with the androids in their plight because the androids seem to be very human. Specifically in the book, they talk a lot about the idea of memory implantation, which is something that they don't cover in the original movie, but 2049 uses it as a pretty substantially important plot point. And I think that ultimately adds to our ability to understand and interpret things in the way that Phillip K. Dick originally intended, because one of the main issues with the Nexus 6 androids is that a lot of them aren't aware of the fact that they're androids because they have had memories implanted in them of a childhood or of parents or of miscellaneous experiences in life, so that when they are out, on Mars or out exploring space and doing these like menial, dangerous tasks that humans can't complete, they'll have some psychological stability. Because if you don't give them memories, which we see in the original Blade Runner, if they don't have memories, then they eventually start to form their own memories and draw their own conclusions. Whereas if you implant memories into an android, you're going to ultimately end up with something that's far more human. And what they ultimately are trying to do, at least it's very clear in the book, what the Rosen Corporation is trying to do is create androids that cannot be differentiated from humans and will ultimately interact with the world in the same way that humans interact with the world. And this is another point where I think that Phillip K. Dick is making an interesting statement about humanity and the human experience. Because he's placing so much importance on the ideas of memory and experience, we get to see what it is he thinks kind of defines someone as being an individual or as having a soul, which, again, they don't mention the idea of having a soul very much in the original Blade Runner. I think the original Blade Runner was trying to handle different material than Blade Runner 2049, but we'll get to that right after we take another quick commercial break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Cover the idea of what it is that Phillip K. Dick is ultimately trying to say about humanity by placing so much emphasis on the ideas of memory and experience acquisition in Blade Runner specifically, because Phillip K. Dick wasn't involved, to my knowledge, in the making of Blade Runner or Blade Runner 2049. I'm talking about specifically his portrayal of that in the Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep novel rather than in the films, though I will kind of compare and contrast them as we're talking about it. So because the androids, the Nexus 6, have had memories implanted in them, their brains are able to form specific connections that other android brains or minds wouldn't be able to. One of the major plot points in this book is the administration of the Voight-Kampff empathy test, which is the way or the primary method by which Rick Deckard is able to differentiate human beings from androids. One of the main plot points is that the test is capable of not being able to identify a Nexus 6 from human. And this terrifies Rick Deckard because there's this whole religious system, which I found to be incredibly interesting in the book, that they don't mention at all in either of the films, which I think is a travesty, because one of the main vessels by which philosophy is imparted in the book is through the belief structure of this religious system. And it's also an excellent commentary on religious beliefs in general, but I want to focus primarily on something else currently, so we'll probably talk about the religious beliefs later. But because these individuals are given memories and their brains are able to form specific pathways that allow for them to draw different conclusions about the world than previous androids had, it helps them to develop a form of empathy. Because I think one of the main things that Phillip K. Dick is exploring in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is the idea of what really separates a truly organic and developed human mind from a synthesized mind that has had memories implanted into it and has been made to believe that it is human. One of the androids specifically is an opera singer, and she is able to kind of evade Rick Deckard, at least at first, because she is so thoroughly entrenched in the belief that she is not an android that she is able to avoid taking the empathy test. Though it is indicated later in the book that she actually is aware of the fact that she's an android and knew how to circumvent having to take the test, partially because it seems like there's this secret society of androids who live on Earth who are kind of protecting each other, but they're all the Nexus 6 models whose brains are advanced enough to start to believe in the idea of like banding together in the same way that humans do. And back to the point, or kind of the topic which I had originally intended to talk about, ultimately what defines humanity and why is memory and experience acquisition so important to this idea. When you get to the line of what makes something human and what gives something a soul, you have to define, where is the idea of self and what makes something special as far as a being is concerned. I think Phillip K. Dick's main argument in the book is that the thing that makes humans special is their ability to empathize with things that are not the same as them, even their ability to empathize with things that could be better than them or worse than them. And that's part of the reason why in the book there's this clear dichotomy. You could call it a dichotomy, but there's multiple dichotomies happening at the same time. There's the dichotomy between individuals who are labeled as specials, who are oftentimes there's like slang terms for them as well. The people who have been affected by the radioactive material to the point of being impotent or having been disfigured. So there's chicken heads and ant heads depending on how far along in the process of losing your mind you are to radiation poisoning. And that's one dichotomy that exists between normal people and chicken heads and ant heads, because normal people, quote unquote, can emigrate to Mars. They can leave Earth because they're still virulent. They're still fertile. Trying to use a fancy word, but I don't know the exact word, so I do apologize. But because they're still able to reproduce, they're allowed to leave, whereas people who are not able to reproduce are not allowed to leave, or if they would reproduce in a way that wasn't advantageous, they're not allowed to leave, which is a whole different bit of commentary that I could absolutely spend another hour talking about, but we're not going to do that. We're going to stay focused, Keith. Too many tangents possible. This book is definitely dense with a lot of interesting commentary on society and on philosophy, so I highly recommend checking it out. But back to the point at hand, when you're getting up to that line of what defines something as human, I think that Phillip K. Dick wants to try to get us to have enough cognitive distance from our own experience that we can kind of look back and say, well, ultimately, what is it that gives something a soul? Is it the fact that it was born organically, or is it the presence of intellect in a certain capacity? Is it the presence of memories? And if it is the presence of memories and experience, then what really makes things so different conceptually for someone to have had implanted memories versus real memories? And this is something that Blade Runner 2049 gets into. It specifically, Ryan Gosling's character says that he's never killed anything that has been brought into the world via natural birth. And the belief is that something that is brought into the world via natural birth has a soul. And what I think is really interesting is that he at some point is made to believe that he was brought into the world via natural birth, and it is this experience that a lot of replicants believe themselves to have experienced, to have been brought into the world via natural birth because of an implanted memory that was created by somebody in the film. I'm already giving away enough spoilers if you haven't seen it, so I'm trying to be a little bit more ambiguous. But there's this idea that, having a soul is ultimately what makes someone human. But there's also this idea that if you are able to live your life in a way that shows purpose beyond just your own existence, that you also could potentially have a soul. So I think that there is an interesting debate or set of ideologies that are at conflict between these two different belief structures. Because if natural birth is the only way by which you get a soul, then somehow there's an intangible value that is ascribed to organic and real experience as being more tangible than an experience that's been implanted in the mind. But if you have a memory that's implanted into your mind so firmly that you believe that it's real, then there's no possible way that you would be able to discern it from any memory that actually is real. And that's part of the reason why some of the androids either feel that they are just as valuable as human beings or feel that they have a soul in the same way that a human person feels that they have a soul or that their experience is more valuable than an intangible one. But I think if we were to look at this objectively, the way that Phillip K. Dick is intending for us to, we would realize that ultimately the memories that we have are a form of virtual reality. And we're going to take another quick commercial break, but I'm going to get more into that point right after that.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Person human and things like that. It's kind of funny. I accidentally talked about this subject again when I watched the movie Her. So I do apologize that we've kind of been on like this same vein of idea throughout the last few episodes. Hopefully, actually we definitely will be talking about something different in the next one. It's just that it's something that seems to be pretty heavy on the minds of people since apparently the 1980s and before when this book was written. So right before the break, I had mentioned this idea that memories are essentially the same as virtual reality, or memories are organic memories that are formed via actual experience are just as meaningful as memories that are formed or memories that are implanted into the minds of the androids. And the reason that I say this is because if you take a look at our current understanding of brain chemistry, our current understanding of modern psychology, ultimately memory is not very concrete. Memory, from an objective point of view, is a series of electrical connections that are formed in, via synapses in the brain that are kind of imprinted into the brain via the formation of those synapses, and then kind of transferred or formed into a different portion of the brain after having been filtered through by the prefrontal cortex, or the portion of our brain that does critical thinking. The problem with memory is that it is tainted by confirmation bias. And I've mentioned that phrase a couple times. I don't know if I've ever gotten into an exact definition, but basically confirmation bias is this idea that when we witness or experience something, and draw a conclusion about it, our brain is going to affirm that conclusion as being real. A great example of this that a lot of people experience is that they purchase a car or a particular item of clothing, and at first they think, oh, I am the only person who has purchased this, or they think, oh, it's not that popular, or it is that popular, and I bought it because it's popular. And then after that, they start to see a lot more people with that particular item of clothing or that particular vehicle in that specific color. I know that as I've purchased vehicles throughout my life, after I've bought the vehicle, I all of a sudden start noticing that a lot of people drive that same vehicle. That's confirmation bias at work, because it's not as if the number of people who are driving that vehicle has changed ultimately. At least it's very unlikely that the number of people driving that vehicle has changed, unless it's a brand new car. In which case, I don't even know if I want to get into the idea that there's a universal phenomena that occurs at specific times. I probably will, because that's part of the religious belief in do androids dream of electric sheep, but I've said this like every segment. We'll get to that later. So, confirmation bias, you see things that confirm your belief about the world. And I've mentioned specifically confirmation bias because we have an evolutionary prerogative to believe that our interpretation of the world is true. And this principle is what so drastically affects memory. Because when we have a memory of something, it gives us the ability, or we're forced to draw a conclusion about something in the world because of that memory. So if you have a traumatic experience or a negative experience with something, your brain is going to remember that and say, we don't want to experience that again. This is, with as far as like childhood trauma and psychology is concerned, this is a major reason that people repeat very destructive patterns in their lives, because they're trying to ultimately avoid something that was negatively reinforced by a parent or a bully or a very bad situation like a car accident or something like that. So people will repeat specific behaviors that actually end up soliciting the same results to them, at least psychologically, because their memory has been tainted by this idea that the way in which they act or the way in which they interpret the world is ultimately correct. So, there's the allegory of the three blind men who are all touching the elephant. And one says, it's very thick like a tree trunk. One says it's very flexible like this. One says it feels like a broom. And they're ultimately just all touching different parts of the elephant. But they are ultimately all touching the elephant. And this is exactly what memory is like between multiple individuals. When you go back to look at a scenario, you're going to get different viewpoints no matter what you do. And almost none of those viewpoints are representative of the whole, because there is this subconscious self that we do not interact with in our regular lives. So there are ways in which you can begin to interact with it, but ultimately it's very difficult to have control over. But this isn't the psychology podcast, so we're not going to get too much into that. But basically the idea is that the thing that observes the world around us, the thing that acquires experience, exists in a subconscious fashion when we look at the way that the brain works. And ultimately, it's the lower functions of the brain that cause us to draw conclusions about those particular things. Usually it's the reward to consequence system. There's a specific word aside from consequence that I can't remember. But basically, the idea is that if we have a positive experience, our brain's going to give us a confirmation bias that whenever we do that thing, we're going to get something. It's the Pavlovian response, essentially, that we would give to like dogs or rats, as saying that, you can train them to do things subconsciously. But that is something that's present in humans as well, just to an even more heightened degree, because we have this emotional attachment to the idea of being right. Because in addition to the lower level functions of the brain that every creature has, at least in some capacity, we have this upper function of the brain that makes us apply emotions to things. Because our brain knows that when we have an emotional response to something, we're more likely to remember it and to either repeat the behavior or stop with that particular behavior. And so our brain is essentially tricking us and manipulating us into acting in specific ways. And this is one of the ways in which, or one of the reasons that I would say that memory is just as, like an organic memory that's been formed is pretty much the same as virtual reality, because you can impart an experience on the mind of an individual, and biologically the brain will form specific neural pathways that will make somebody either repeat or not repeat specific behaviors in order to get the desired results. But the desired results aren't something that we're operating towards in our conscious minds. They're occurring in our subconscious minds. And so the idea that organic memories are more valuable than inorganic memories really doesn't hold clout when it comes to looking at things objectively in the way that Phillip K. Dick is trying to convince us to do throughout Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. Because when we believe arbitrarily that organic memories are more real, then we believe that there must be something special about being human. And that theme isn't really mentioned a lot in the beginning of the book, but as you get towards the end of it, it becomes pretty present as far as how are you differentiating between what is human and what is android, and why are we doing that in this particular fashion. There is a specific interaction with one of the androids who's an opera singer where Rick Deckard concludes that the reason that he has to get rid of the androids is because they're so superior to humans that they will eventually replace them. And I think that that's a terrifying thought, for one. I haven't gotten to the end of the book. If I remember correctly, there's like a plot twist at some point that implies that a lot of androids have already replaced human beings, but I can't speak to that because, again, I'm not at the end of the book. But we're going to continue talking about this right after this next quick commercial break.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Rick Deckard in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is inclined to, is required to retire androids who have escaped from Mars or the outer colonies and come to Earth in order to have a more, I guess, reasonable life would be the right way to phrase it. They're pretty much just slave labor. That's their primary function as far as their off-world duties are concerned, which, of course, if you are able to draw your own conclusions about life and, deduce certain things, you're definitely not going to be inclined to want to complete that work in the same way that you would if, at all, really. So we were talking about specifically Rick Deckard's conclusion that androids were a superior form of humans and that they ultimately would replace humans, and the kind of terrifying idea that presents to Rick Deckard. And one of the kind of conflicts that exists in the meta-narrative of the book, and not necessarily in the actual narrative, is the conflict between the religious system in the book and the reality of the world in which they live. And the religious system is known as Mercerism. And essentially, and this is something that's not included in either of the films, which I think it makes sense that they wouldn't add this because it really does kind of make this particular subject matter cross the line from nerdy or from kind of geeky or like pop science fiction. Yeah, that's the way I would phrase it. It makes the material cross the line from pop science fiction to very like nerdy or intellectually intense science fiction. And that is kind of what Villanueva was going for in 2049. But if you watch the original theatrical cut of Blade Runner from the 80s, they definitely were going for like a more pop culture or pulpified, I guess would be the right way to phrase it, pulpified version of science fiction that was easily consumable and didn't necessarily require the audience to be super invested in the intellectual aspects of the film. That's part of the reason, I think, why the producers of that film originally told Ridley Scott that we are going to include the narration when Ridley Scott didn't want the narration included, which is why it's not in the director's or the final cut, which I think ultimately makes the film better, which is why I would say watch the final cut if you are going to watch the original Blade Runner, but that's neither here nor there. So Mercerism is this religious system that's kind of a mixture of Eastern principles with Judeo-Christian values is the way I would kind of classify it. There's this idea of universal oneness in life that's based probably off of the principle in physics where no energy is lost, and there are specific references made especially by Isidore, James Isidore, the gentleman who is he's called a chicken head throughout the book because of the radiation poisoning that he's been exposed to. But he basically says that one of the main tenets of Mercerism is that all life is valuable and all life ultimately is equivalent in value. There is maybe a bit of an implication that includes electronic life in some capacity because, again, there's no energy loss in Mercerism. Things just kind of cycle. So it would make sense that in Mercerism, there is a possibility for an individual to die and then be, quote-unquote, replaced by an android, and for that to just be a part of the cycle of life. And Mercerism is in conflict with the reality of the world, because the reality of the world is that humans believe themselves to possess a special element in their experience. They think that their memories are more visceral, or that they have souls and that the electronic things do not, though Deckard definitely starts to feel a conflict about that at some point in the novel. Probably about like halfway through, he starts to feel that particular conflict. And I think that the reason that the conflict between Mercerism and the rest of the world adds so much to the novel is that it really serves as a storytelling mechanic to drive home Phillip K. Dick's point, which is that ultimately human beings aren't any more aren't any more superior or any more inferior than the artificial beings that the androids are. And the reason that I say this is because I think that Phillip K. Dick is just looking at human life and human experience from this incredibly objective standpoint and trying to really force us into a place of asking, like, what has meaning? What has specialness to it? What is sanctified and what is separate, and what is simply obligatory? You know, the way that we interact with the world is often very obligatory and subconscious because we aren't mindful of the way in which we are interacting with the world. And I think Phillip K. Dick's biggest point is that we absolutely have to be mindful of the ways in which we interact with the world, or we're going to lose all sense of self, all sense of meaning. There is another principle in Mercerism where it is very important for life to foster other life. And one of the main components of the Nexus 6 that hasn't been present in other androids is that they will band together with other androids. In the past, part of the reason that the Voight-Kampff scale that Deckard uses to identify androids is so effective is because androids don't care about what happens to other androids. And there is a little bit of that, I guess you could call it like a version of psychopathy in the androids who are in the novel. But ultimately, because humans have this genetically encoded desire to perpetuate their existence via survival or offspring or like the nurturing of life in some capacity, the androids, because they're based off of human genetic material or human biological material, also share that same desire, but they share it in a more sinister way where it's not communally based the way that humans do. But we find out pretty quickly that as soon as the Nexus 6 models start to team up, they become a very powerful force to be reckoned with. They start acting in ways that we would consider to be more human, but they have mixed into that this kind of predatory detachment from empathy or and maybe probably even from sympathy as well. And the Voight-Kampff scale tests for responses to empathy. And I had mentioned earlier that your brain kind of tricks you into doing certain things, and the reason that the Voight-Kampff scale is so effective in the book is because it measures subconscious responses to the idea of empathy. It's not just it asks questions like, what would you do if there was a wasp on your arm? And then judges your response as well as the timing of your response through biological interactions with that question. Heart rate, eye movement, things like that. And I don't know if there's any clout to being able to measure those particular things, but the fact that it is measuring subconscious responses that these androids have no control over is what makes it a good scale. Because humans also have no control over those responses. So there's a difference in the patterns that occur within those two responses. And I'm going to kind of talk about this a little bit more in our last segment, and then we'll wrap it up, and I'll decide if I felt like we've covered enough of this subject for me to not talk about it next week. But so far, because I'm only like 60% of the way through the book, I definitely am leaning towards doing another podcast on this particular subject matter. So we will be right back after this quick commercial break.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely enough in this book for me to talk at least a little bit about it next week on Wednesday. So we'll kind of wrap up this discussion then. But there is something else that I kind of wanted to, well, not kind of, that I do want to talk about specifically in regards to Mercerism and what Phillip K. Dick is trying to say, both about religion and our understanding of the world as human beings. So before the break, I had mentioned this idea of giving purpose or meaning to things and deciding what is sacred or set apart from other things. You know, what makes human life separate from replicated human life. So there's a philosopher by the name of Friedrich Nietzsche, who is from the early 1900s, late 1800s. He's an existentialist. And existentialism is essentially the idea that that nothing has intrinsic value. It is given value by individuals within a society, and then eventually, because society kind of ultimately serves a similar purpose to what individuals serve, that is to perpetuate ideas and perpetuate the existence of a thing, we end up adopting the beliefs of society and of culture into our own belief system. Because society is a kind of a being in itself. It's a collective consciousness that is comprised of the ideas or the similar ideas of individuals. The same way that like a romantic relationship kind of creates this being of a relationship. You know, when this is just kind of a funny tidbit about me, when I am in a relationship, I kind of view that relationship in the same way that I would view like a human being. So if it's, you know, I've said to significant others in the past, you know, like our relationship's only a year old, like it can probably barely walk and it's just muttering noises at this particular point. It's not like forming coherent sentences. And society, I think, is the same way, just on a much, much larger scale. And so society takes all the values of these individuals and ascribes sanctification to them because they're shared amongst individuals. And this is ultimately what solicits the creation of things like religion or cultural norms or gender roles. Those things aren't intrinsic to our biological makeup. And I think that that is definitely something that Phillip K. Dick is trying to talk about in the ideas of Mercerism in this book. Nietzsche's biggest thing that he hated about religion was that it was ultimately nihilism in disguise. So a lot of people want to credit Nietzsche with being the father of nihilism, but I think that that's a gross misunderstanding of what it was that Nietzsche was all about. Nietzsche vehemently hated the ideas of nihilism, hated the idea that everything meant nothing, and hated the idea of purposelessness. Though he ultimately does argue that without conscious effort and mindfulness, we will fall into nihilism. He's not an advocate for that belief structure at all, and I think that he has the nomenclature of his name has an unfortunate association with nihilism, but nihilism is based off of the root word nihil, which basically means, you know, of nothing. So it's just, yeah, it's a very frustrating point for me when I have philosophical discussions with people and they try to tell me that Nietzsche is a nihilist. He is absolutely not. And the reason that he thinks that religion is a form of nihilism is because of the idea of an afterlife. And this is something that is addressed in the ideas of Mercerism. According to Nietzsche, the idea of a heaven or an afterlife takes away the purposefulness of the life that you're living now. And one of Nietzsche's more controversial ideas is that, like, morals are things created by society in order to hinder the strong, and they're used by individuals who are, I guess, kind of sheep, which is funny that the title of the book is Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? I think that there's definitely a lot of meaning in the title, and he picked that animal intentionally. But to get all of this back together, since I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, so nihilism is something that I think Phillip K. Dick also hated, and that is part of the reason that he is creating this narrative in a way that forces us to become so cognitively distant from the ideas or from our perception of the world around us and our subconscious ideas of human life being special simply because it's human life and not because it has some sort of extra applied meaning to it. So he does this in order to make us like really think, like, what is it that makes life special? And Mercerism, I think, represents part of his idea structure because it gives profound purpose to every aspect of life. including things that we interact with or care for, because it places a great deal of impetus on individuals who believe themselves to be unique or more real than other things to perpetuate that which is also real, but at the same time handle with grace and acceptance the things that ultimately will replace them or that they will evolve into, which in a way I think that androids do represent a form of evolution for the human species, according to Phillip K. Dick, because they do have ultimately like superior biological components to them that humans don't, because they're designed. And the idea of religion and of God and of creators and destroyers is something that is very present in Blade Runner 2049 and kind of present in Blade Runner and absolutely very present in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which I think is one of the main conflicts that Rick Deckard is undergoing throughout the novel, because he is curious, like we use the phrase retiring as if to dehumanize these things. And he straight up asks another bounty hunter that he meets as he's going through this whole journey, do you think that androids have souls? And this is something that Blade Runner 2049 deals with quite a lot. One of the main aspects is, that Ryan Gosling's character doesn't want to kill something with a soul, and in some capacity he believes that if you've been birthed through a natural process rather than manufactured in the way that he and other replicants were, that you do possess a soul. And I think that Phillip K. Dick would kind of appreciate the tension in that idea. But back to Mercerism and why I think that it kind of represents a denial of what modern religion does. It has a lot of similar characteristics to modern religion in that people are indoctrinated into the belief system. Their emotions are played upon rather than their intellect being played upon at first. But the conclusions that are drawn by Mercerism ultimately have much more purpose and much more value than your standard religious beliefs do, because Mercerism is a result of the desire for an explanation of the world around us that comes from something more pragmatic and current than past religious beliefs. Oftentimes when you get into a discussion with individuals about, religion, there's this perception that religions that were created more recently are, cults or are less viable. So, we'll look at Mormonism as being an oddity or Scientology as being an oddity. And I'm not saying that they're not necessarily, but what I am saying is that they're not any more odd than the idea of believing in, the divine purpose of biblical scripture. And I am an individual of faith, so I am not trying to advocate for either side in this particular instance. So I'm just trying to look objectively at what it is that Phillip K. Dick is saying about religion. And ultimately what I think he's saying is that religion is a part of culture and a part of the natural human desire to explain the unexplained in a way that gives purpose. And I think that in him saying this, what he's essentially saying is that spirituality is something that can really help us cope with the harshness of the world around us if it's spirituality that is pragmatic and quote-unquote alive. There's a reason that he doesn't talk about Catholicism or Christianity as being around. I think there might be one mention of the ideas of old religions, but Mercerism is the new kind of like state religion, if you will, though I don't know if it's officially supported by the government. He doesn't get very much into the inner machinations of government. He kind of skirts around those ideas just by talking about the bureaucracy that occurs within like police forces. So Mercerism ultimately is a denial of, or is it's kind of, the way I would phrase it is that Phillip K. Dick is using Mercerism in the same way that Carl Jung or Jacques Lacan uses Freud's work as a basis for their own conclusions. Phillip K. Dick is taking the principles of religion and saying, well, what if we looked at it from the perspective of it having been developed as part of this larger group mindset and not this one individual or this small group of individuals who are trying to manipulate a large population? What if religion was something that is created as a part of culture and a part of the experience of individuals within that culture and then is adopted by individuals in that culture as being true or as having some sort of inside track towards real knowledge and understanding? And this, I think, is why I would say that Phillip K. Dick is including a lot of elements of Nietzsche's beliefs on religion, because ultimately Mercerism says that everything has purpose and that even the act of or the process of death is something that is natural and beautiful and sad in a way. And it's in a different way than how most people would interpret religious texts to handle death. And one of the main things that Phillip K. Dick is take these universal experiences that everybody has a certain perception of and kind of try to subvert them through the plot and the setting of this world that is so different from our own, but is also so relatable to our own that we can get enough cognitive distance to actually be in a place where when he says something and we think about it, we're forced to draw a conclusion about it in a way that we wouldn't otherwise draw it. And that's part of why I do think that this book is good, even though the prose aren't necessarily the best thing in the world. So that's going to wrap it up for us this week. I think on Wednesday I will definitely be finishing this discussion up. As I listen to more of the book, there's definitely a lot to talk about, so I imagine that we'll do at least half of the next podcast on this book, which I would say I apologize for, but I feel like there's just a lot of material and a lot of good storytelling mechanics and a lot of good science fiction tropes that ultimately contribute to my enjoyment and hopefully your enjoyment of this book. It's pretty cheap as far as audiobooks are concerned. I think it's like $10 on the Google app. So, and if you have an Audible subscription, it could be your free book for the month. I highly recommend it if you haven't listened to it or read it, especially if you listen to this podcast. I think that you could draw a lot of meaning out of it and draw conclusions that are different from my own. And I think that that is part of the beauty of literary analysis. So appreciate you guys listening today. Definitely give us a like, hit that subscribe button, give us 5 stars, follow us on Twitter or Facebook and what have you. And I hope you guys have a good week. Stay safe out there. I will see you all, quote unquote, you all on Wednesday.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.